Hello and welcome to another episode of the Gentleman's Journal podcast. I'm Joe Bullmore. I'm the editor of Gentleman's Journal, and our guest on today's episode is Jeremy King, the restaurateur behind the park where we're sitting today, but also behind Simpson's on the Strand and Arlington, some of the most beloved restaurants in London at the moment. And we're going to talk to Jeremy all about his long career in restaurants and also the opening in a matter of days of Simpson's on the Strand. Jeremy, thank you for joining us on the Gentleman's Journal podcast.
Great pleasure.
We're here in the private dining room. Is that the best way to describe it?
Yeah.
At the park, which is a beautiful space and which you've just revealed has a sort of map of Central Park, the park, above us on the ceiling.
Bird's eye view. Yeah.
Bird's eye view. So tell me about this place that we're sitting in. It's obviously on Hyde Park, but it's got a distinctly kind of mid-century American feel. How did it all come about?
It started during the period that after I'd left what was then Corbin King, Wolseley hospitality group, and I was looking for new sites. Not aggressively as such. I was just keeping my eyes out, and the agent said, "Do you want to have a look at Park Modern, on the corner of Queensway and Bayswater Road?" I said, "No." And they said, "Oh, no, come on, go along." And I always do, because I remember same agent asking the same question about what became Brasserie Zadell.
Right, yeah.
And I think it's fundamental to me is that I get inspired by buildings. And so I walked in here, and although there were transfers on the windows, you could feel in the restaurant this sense of light. And I said, I'm interested. And one of the reasons I was interested is because whilst Chris and I had specialized in what one might call early 20th century Grand Cafe, brasserie type operations, I've always dreamt of doing something more contemporary. And I thought, well, this is the opportunity. And as is my wont, I'll stand or sit in the site or look at it. And I was trying to think, well, it's fine. We can do a Grand Cafe for our times, but what's the food? You can't do schnitzel and necessarily, although in fact we do a chicken schnitzel. Let me think about the name. And then the name came to me straight away, which has to be called The Park, as it's sat at the entrance to Hyde Park. And then it followed quite quickly. I thought, this feels like New York. This doesn't feel like London. This feels as though it's actually looking over Central Park, and hence the seat, this map which you referred to. And so I thought, what would my friends in New York do if they had this sort of place? And soon I was going into the realms of that big movement in New York when Californian Italian-inspired cuisine was brought to New York. There were quite a lot of exemplars of it, from Jonathan Waxman being a good one indeed, Michael McCarthy, and so on. And so it went from there. So although it wasn't entirely contemporary, and my chronology was going backwards towards the 50s, it felt that way. And I've always loved the Four Seasons in the Seagram building, which is of course still there in its own form with the Major Food Group. But I loved, that was always my favorite building. And one of the reasons it was because the restaurant was created in harmony with the building. Yeah. And although Mies van der Rohe was a bit disdainful about designing the interiors of restaurants, Philip Johnson came along and, of course, created for me the absolutely sublime interior. And so it moved on from there. So there we had New York Italian American cuisine, the walls, 50s Corbusier prints, all about the right angle. There's from a poem about the right angle. Alex Katz, who of course was very, very big post-war in New York, and suddenly I knew what it was going to look like.
Okay. Wow. It's amazing the different sort of tendrils you pull on.
Very much so. And for me, that's part of the fun of it. I think I was always a frustrated architect manqué, but I knew I would never be a great architect. But one of the beauties of being in the restaurant business is that the things which I really was interested in, apart from people and food, of course, was very much about architecture, history, music, art. And I am often heard to say that the fun I get out of restaurants is when they're a catalyst for people to be creative and do things, whether that's socially, emotionally, even romantically. And that to my mind, all the major artistic movements, whether in music, painting, literature, even revolution and politics, have all emanated from grand cafes.
Right.
And this is where it all starts.
Brilliant. Okay. So who knows what works of art could be made upstairs in the park over the next decade?
Yes. Who knows what's... I mean, I've seen over the years, it's always been the fun of might be a creative team for musicals or whatever it might be. Seeing those first meetings of authors with publishers and agents, and so it goes on. And that for me is the fun, because restaurateuring, if it's purely, I say to the staff, if it's purely about creating a room, putting out a menu, sitting people down, taking an order, cooking some food, delivering, clearing the plates, it's actually fairly boring as a profession. If you know who the people are, what they're eating, why they're together, who they know in the room, the architecture of the place you're in, how food is grown or raised, look at wine. I know a lot about wine, but even if I took a year off and studied wine, I'd really still have a long way to go. And so what people don't realize, because they particularly in this country for a long time, we've associated restaurants with being server and service, is that it's actually far more interesting than the majority of occupations.
Yeah, absolutely. At the start, you mentioned Zadell, and when we first met on this podcast in 2020, we were sitting above one of your other restaurants, the Wolseley, in a whirring, huge office. It was actually, I think, one of the hottest days of the summer, and it was in a suit and tie, trying to mimic your amazing attire, and it was very hot and sweaty, I remember. But it was a very different time for us to meet then, not just because we were in the middle of a global pandemic, which was tough for everyone, but especially hospitality, but also because just 2 years later, all of those properties essentially were taken away from you.
Yeah, although actually, I'm not too sensitive about it. I would possibly adjust that and say I chose to relinquish them.
Right.
And the reason, it was a complicated story because I was fighting with my shareholders, and they had the trump card in terms of control, although I could control the destiny of the restaurants, and I refused to go to Saudi Arabia with the Wolseley, as it happens. I just felt it was inappropriate. They had a term loan which technically was out of date. That was through no fault of my own. So we were forced into this position where we had to bid against each other for the control of the company. And I had support from New York, and if they'd had their way, we would have continued bidding. Although I gather that Minor International, who were the partners, would have gone a lot higher.
Right.
I wish I had gone, because that would have been beneficial. But I felt I had to pull out, and I said to my new investors, I said that we have to pull out, because if we pay any more, I will spend the rest of my life paying you off.
Yeah.
And I won't have control of the business. And so that was no longer of interest. So it was a self-inflicted deprivation, but actually is one of the best things I ever did.
Yeah. Did it always feel like that? Were there moments when it was particularly painful or poignant?
It was poignant.
Mm.
My wife Lauren was flying to LA the day of the auction. The auction was meant to happen at 9 a.m. in the morning, and eventually happened 2 a.m. the following morning.
Wow.
And I said, I think we might lose it, and maybe it's not such a bad thing. And of course, emotionally, it might be difficult. But I think a very telling moment was about, I don't know, 2 months later. We were driving up Piccadilly, and I drove past the Wolseley, and I didn't realize she was looking at me, and she said, "You didn't look." I said, "No, I never do. I move on. I always move on."
Wow.
And it's actually because otherwise, and it's a life philosophy for me, is I tend never to get upset about something which I'm going to forget. And and it might be a week or a month or a year, but I'm going to forget about it eventually, unless it's a mistake I've made which affects other people, or it's a health issue or something. So I move on, and of course, the feeling I had was of emancipation, and comparatively slowly, I built back. And one of the reasons it's slower than anticipated is because the major project now is Simpsons, and that, instead of taking maybe maximum 2 years, is taking the best part of 4 years to bring to fruition.
Right.
But at least we've got there.
You've got there. You're about to get there even more. And we'll get to Simpsons in a moment. I wonder, I don't want to say something as trite as everything happens for a reason or something like that, but in a way, that might be the best thing that could have ever happened.
Totally. And I'm enjoying myself immensely.
Yeah.
I have some very, very good investors, and nobody as has happened before, because I was with private equity, which was ghastly beyond ghastly. And one of the problems, I think Steve Jobs always said that the great tragedy about big business and small entrepreneurs is that, and he was talking about Apple, he said, we see somebody who's innovative and breakthrough, wonderful people, and we think, oh, we've got to get involved with them. We've got to have a share in them, or even buy them, because they're so brilliant. And then as soon as we acquire them, we start telling them how to do it, which negates the whole reason for getting involved with them, because they're doing it in a different way.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, in many ways, not entirely, but in many ways, restaurateuring defies the ability to make large groups, because the best restaurateuring is in that word, which is a restaurateur rather than a restaurant owner.
Okay.
And what we see nowadays is there's far too many restaurant owners compared with restaurateurs. And what I mean by that is a restaurant owner does it from the boardroom, and a restaurateur does it from the floor. And you see the difference normally.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there a sort of a natural size of a restaurant collective or groups that you think is too big? At what point does it flip and become unwieldy?
I'm not sure. Is one of those coefficients which is difficult to define, and some people are doing multiple restaurants extremely well. I mean, you think of Von Gericht and or Nobu and so on. Majority of those are very, very good restaurants, and they've managed to do it. It's a particular style of cuisine, maybe. And I'm often surprised, and I think we've pushed it too far. But without being controversial and name some of these groups, which are amazing when there were 3 or 4, start to go through problems.
Okay.
And
which ones? We can all think of some, I think.
Well,
probably.
I think we could all think of 1 or 2 of making incursions into London, and and I'm not sure that's a good idea. And you look at someone like Keith McNally, who's had his ups and downs, but that's a small group of restaurants. And I think because the restaurateur dominates as opposed to the shareholder, it can actually work. But you look at it was always the big dilemma with Soho House, is that Nick Jones managed to keep it personal, make it feel as though it was still him. You might not see him, but you felt it in there. I don't know when it got too big.
Yeah, before my time, definitely. That is a group which is constantly harking back to some imagined kind of 90s heyday, which I'm sure was very fun.
It was unbelievable and extraordinary and incredibly accomplished.
Yeah.
But then
hard to keep that going.
Well, and also monetary considerations can often be the foe of restaurants.
Yeah, certainly. So you will soon be at 3 restaurants again.
3.
I suppose the question to ask is, you didn't have to do any. At that point, you probably could have sailed off into the sunset, almost literally, if you'd have wanted to.
Well, I suppose so, but I didn't really have any money.
Well, that's a problem.
That's one of the problems about restaurateuring is that often the richer people are those who successfully do the chains. I suppose I could have, but I didn't want to. I've seen too many people, I suppose, go into atrophy because they retire too soon, and I really enjoyed it. Although I suppose, put it in perspective, in terms of 3 restaurants, the Simpsons is actually itself got 2 restaurants and a big private room and two bars, so it's a fairly big one.
Yeah.
And I'm often asked, are you going to do any more? I say, I don't know, because I'll say no, and then something will come along. I go, ooh, I can't resist. And I'd love to do another hotel. Because hotel is in many ways the supreme achievement of hospitality.
Absolutely, it is.
It's 24 hours a day.
Yeah. And your hotel was the Beaumont.
The Beaumont, yeah.
Which feels like it could sit above this place in a way.
In many ways, and there's certain similarities. And that was a great shame. That was, in many ways, the only one which really upset me, because I became a victim of a fight between, at the time, the CEO at Grosvenor, who were the ultimate landlords, and the private equity people I was with, and I got caught in the middle. And that was the one which really made me sad, and because it was unnecessary, and for me it was incredibly gratifying doing it.
Yeah.
Sadly, it's changed almost completely.
It has, sadly. When I went there in its pomp, it was remarkable, and I didn't realize till many years later that it was a multi-story car park before it was that.
Absolutely.
It feels like it's one of those things that had been there since the 1920s.
And that was the wonderful thing about it. And I have this predilection for, if I've got a building which doesn't immediately talk to, such as the Wolseley, which, although it had been built as a car showroom, became a bank, and then became a restaurant. I like inventing stories about, and because it gives a sense of purpose, because definition in anything we do is so crucial. And in restaurant terms, for instance, when we opened Chique's, I told my colleagues and Chris, we're only going to do fish. And Tim Hughes, who was the head chef there, I said, only fish. Most people were saying, this is ridiculous. We can't just have a fish restaurant. And customers were saying it, and my colleagues, I said, no, fish restaurants have existed for a long time. And Tim said, what sort of fish? And I said, well, I don't want grilled mahi-mahi with a mango salsa. I want a traditional. And he very cleverly said, just British coastal waters. I said, yes. So immediately there's definition. And that was one of the best menus I've ever done, because it was so defined. Because if you look at restaurants nowadays, a lot of them it's sort of homogenized. Yeah,
vague European modern.
Yes, sort of. And I remember my private equity partners, when we opened Fisher's, which was a quintessentially Viennese restaurant. They would say, and because their friends had said, oh, you can't hope to be successful in Marylebone unless you've got a Caesar salad and a hamburger. I said, no, absolutely not. Now it's harder. There's much. The short term is easier if you go for the market. If you stick sushi on, you stick all these things on. But the customers are much more savvy than restaurateurs believe. And if they feel that you don't know what you're meant to be doing yourself, and therefore they don't know either, then you lose the support. And a word which I often use in restaurants, and I think in life generally, is authority. And authority is when people believe in you. And you might be a clothes designer, and somebody say, "Well, that's a bit different, but I trust them because they deserve the trust. I will invest in that particular clothing," and it can be in any number of ways. And you have the authority with which Citroën, the cars that they started manufacturing in the 60s, were completely different.
Beautiful.
Whereas, and that they had the authority and people bought into it. If we go out on the road today, it's very difficult to differentiate between the different cars because everybody's copying each other. And in restaurants, people copy each other. And nobody's allowed. It's one of my big laments about life at the moment is that intuition and instinct have been marginalized. Everything has to be proof of concept, statistically, like what was that Brad Pitt film, Moneyball?
Right, yeah. Moneyball.
Everything can be justified through statistics, and it can, but it strips the fun out of life.
Definitely.
And most of the best things I've ever done have been when I've used my instinct or intuition or acted, being suspicious about things and thought, no, this is a person is a bad one. And everyone said, no, you're wrong, they're fantastic. And then they turn out to be compulsive thieves or whatever it might be. I do wish we use more intuition. And I think as a restaurateur, you open best restaurants are the ones when restaurateurs say, I'm going to do a restaurant that I would like to attend. And hopefully enough other people will do it.
Yeah, that's a pretty good metric.
Yeah.
I remember Graydon Carter actually he was talking about magazines, but he was referring to his restaurants and that he's had restaurants which have failed and restaurants which have obviously been incredibly successful. And he said the difference is the ones that were successful had a point, which is such an obvious thing to say, but it comes back to your definition idea. They had a reason.
Yeah, and I hadn't heard him say that, but I think they had a point is really good.
Yeah. And it's very easy to sort of agglomerate 4 or 5 other successful things together, but it looked good on paper, but it actually have no real reason or kind of idea behind it. Interesting, when you talk about sort of people, do you think you have a very finely tuned radar for temperament and sensibility, and can you spot a rogue in the grass, so to speak?
It happened once in particular, when I caught somebody at the Ivy stealing a loaf of bread.
Okay.
And I said to Mitchell, who's the general manager, they've got to go. And he said, but I know they stole, but it was a loaf of bread. And you've seen things like that and you've not sacked. And I said, it's the way they stole. And this guy, he was 40 years old, very popular, cried and said, I've never stolen a thing in my life, etc. And I insisted he went. And it was the closest I ever had to a staff dissent.
Right.
And Mitchell, who's a wonderful general manager, was angry with me. And he said, you can't do it for a loaf of bread. I said, I know, but I'm not acting out Les Miserables. It's not Javert and all that. He's a thief. And they were very disgruntled for about 3 weeks until the police came looking for this guy. And he was the head of a credit card fraud ring. And
Wow.
He was using all our customer credit cards to defraud. And the police started saying, did he bring in clothing from his brother-in-law's shop? And they're going, yes. And they said, yeah, it was all stolen goods. It was all. And so and they went, okay. And go back to that instinct and intuition is that often if we are hiring somebody and ultimately I'm going to sign off, they will come in for their first interview and I'll try and get in and say hello. And it might be for 2 minutes or 1 minute or 2 minutes. And I get a feeling from it. And as it happens, and you have to believe in yourself, it tends to work. So people rather like that. If
Yeah.
I feel something's wrong, and I think it's a good restaurateur walks into a restaurant. We know whether it's going well or not just by instinct or
Okay.
intuition.
In the first 5 seconds.
Yeah. And I mean, Adrian Gill used to talk about the hum of a successful restaurant. You can feel when a restaurant's really working as opposed to just full. Full is not enough. It's full and happy is important.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Are there questions you ask potential interviewees when you pop your head in? Are there certain things you throw them to see how they react, perhaps?
No, not even. Occasionally, if I'm doing a full interview, it might be. Often I'll say, "Oh, hello, you're Josh." You know, whatever it might be, and it's how they respond.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of these tricks. I believe that the best, and I find it very hard to persuade managers, but the best interview for a waiter, you can spend an hour talking about theory and so on, is give them 3 plates and ask them to pick it up, because the way they pick up 3 plates tells you whether they've done that job for a while or not. And I've known people who claim their silver service on the Queen Elizabeth and can't even pick up 3 plates. In fact, what was his name? Anton Mosselman. One of his major tests for a chef was giving them a large pot and asking them to take it to the wash up. And he said, I can tell by the way they carry the pot and move across the room whether they're actually good in the kitchen.
Wow. How's your plate game? Are you good at
my
handling
plate
plates?
game? My plate game actually. We were talking about Zadell. I think I got I got credibility because we had a group in Zadell, which was actually my entire accounts team, etc. Somebody was leaving, and I went to say hello, and they hadn't been cleared.
Ah.
And I was looking, so I thought, I'll clear. There was 8 of them, and so I started clearing, and then the waiters
In horror.
came running over, and I said, nope, too late. And
4 on each arm, surely not.
And then they started to, and then I said, no, it's okay. And then they're watching, and it was so clear that they were saying, go on then.
Yeah.
You're going to drop them. And I cleared 8.
Wow.
Covers,
in one go.
Because you can do it if you know how to do it.
That's pretty good.
And they went, okay. And but in a way, in essence, that's the point, is that if the staff believe that you're equal to them, there is no superiority. And one of the most important things for me in life is egalitarianism. And we're all appointed, there's a hierarchy, and we're appointed, but we're all the same people. We're all capable of being CEOs and so on and so forth. And in fact, it was back in Delaunay days. I remember a maitre d'hotel came and joined us, and he'd come from quite a big group, and with a high profile personality at the head of it. And 3 weeks in, he said, been with you 3 weeks. And previous place I was 3 years. A, you know my name, and B, I've talked to you more times in 3 weeks than I talked to your equivalent in 3 years. And I think people care about that.
Of course.
And again, it goes back to restaurant owners, because when you're in the boardroom, you can make decisions which affect people, because you don't have to look them in the eye. You don't have to work with them. You don't have to experience the ramifications. You purely think that'll save us 5%, that'll save us 10%. My belief is that often when you feel you're saving, it actually costs you. And there are so many hidden benefits which are not seen on the balance sheet, but are felt when the restaurant goes into perpetuity.
Will you be in most of your restaurants every day if you can?
Yeah. I mean, of course I work with Robert Holland, who joined me at Ivy in end of 1990, beginning 91. And we always make sure one of us is in the restaurant. It's going to be harder with Simpsons, but there are ways of doing it. Well, what's amazing is that when I look back, the first restaurant I opened with Chris was in 81 and I was 27. And I probably got 20 people who are much more qualified and experienced than I was then to open restaurants. Now it's a much harder business, but one of the most gratifying things when thinking of Simpsons was that the Savoy very kindly lent us a private room to bring in all the management, and there's about 25 people in management, and I went to join them to talk to them, and I walked through the door and it couldn't see the room immediately. Walked through the door, just a few people at a table, turned around and realized how many people there were, and that 85% of them had worked before. I'd worked with before and knew their name, and they're all so capable. So, and it was one of the great moments for me, because at that point I was slightly fretting because the estimated time we started to open the doors, do trials, soft openings, was the same week as my daughter was getting married in New York. And I suddenly thought, it's absolutely fine. They don't need me.
Wow.
They can get this restaurant open really well. Yes, it's great if I'm there because I'll know a lot of the customers and so on and so forth, but I'm not needed. And it was one of the great feelings.
Okay, what a relief.
Yeah.
The process with Simpsons would have been different, I suppose, to other restaurants you've done before, because whereas, as you say, you often create things on a feeling or how a building looks and feels with a kind of novelistic backstory. With this, there is a huge amount of backstory already. It's a very historic site.
Yes.
What's the kind of potted history, if you can go back that far, of Simpsons in the Strand?
Well, Simpsons is interesting because, like a lot of London's institutions, it started off as a coffee house, and coffee houses were the great meeting places. Lloyd's of London was a coffee house. The Garrick Club was a coffee house. All these places, and Simpsons as a coffee house wasn't originally called Simpsons. Opened in 1828, so we're coming up to 200 years. Roughly on that site, and then was taken over by a Mr. Simpson, I think 1850, and it became known as the home of chess.
Really?
And it's very, very strong chess association. And chess in the 19th century was massive. I mean, for a lot of people, it was the equivalent of Premier League football.
Right. Wow.
And people would play games and runners would go off with the results because people would bet and all sorts of things. And indeed, the bigger games, because they started having world championships at Simpsons. The question I get asked all the time, as indeed Robert, every service of people, are you opening Simpsons? Yes. When's it opening? Are you keeping the trolleys? And the trolleys were roast beef. And people don't realize that originated because chess players didn't want to be interrupted, but the game could go on for quite a while if it wasn't a timed game. And so they'd bring the trolleys around to serve beef to the players, and so they could carry on playing, but it stayed with it. And the trolleys and the carvers are very symbolic of the whole place, and that thing whereby you tip your carver and so on and so forth, which will be interesting in a non-cash era. How I pulled that off.
And will you encourage that for people to tip the carver?
I think that it's by way of a digression. I think successful restaurants feel like clubs.
Right.
I remember when the Ivy had been taken over and it was announced this is after our time, it was announced it was going to be a club. Some wag said, the Ivy's opening a club? I always thought it was a club.
Yeah.
And that's the best way with restaurants. And indeed, Margot, my daughter, who's got a bar, quasi-restaurant, and will do more, operates in New York. And people think that's a club, but it actually isn't. But it's just a narrow cast of who you want in there. And that's one of the big things for me about publicity and so on, is actually historically I've always narrow casted rather than broadcasted, just so that the people feel comfortable. So with Simpsons, with the carvers, people in the know will know that you give something to the carver, and we'll
Okay.
facilitate that if you want to give some cash. And your guests might think, what is that? Restaurants for me are quasi clubs. So for instance, I'll get asked, why don't we put up a sign to show where the restrooms are, to use a, and my reaction is always, because you only ever ask once.
Right.
And if you're a tourist place, you might need to put the sign up because people are constantly asking. But if it's the sort of restaurant I like, you ask once. And what it means is the next time you're there and you want to go to the loo, you get up and you walk with a confidence and a sense of belonging to the loo. And when your guest says, where is the loo? You can just say, oh, let's go past the clock or whatever it is. And it's the first step. And the steps of membership of a restaurant as club or feeling a club, of course, is when you walk through the door, if they know your name, or if you order some food and say, would you like some wine? Yeah, I'll have a little white wine. Oh, would you like the Piqueball de Pinet? And it's a sense of belonging. And I mean, the ultimate is that they know your name, where what sort of experience you like. Even you get an account, so you can get, in a perfect world, you can get up and walk out, which is how it is in the clubs. And I'm very keen on all that sort of thing happening. With Simpsons, it's got, going back to your question about the history, it doesn't need to have that, because I don't have to invent it. The Beaumont, which we're talking about, I invented a very, very detailed history, and people took it so seriously. I'd have people coming in and say, oh, my parents or my grandparents used to use this as a hotel. And I was thinking, well, they must have slept in their car because it was a garage. But anyway, if people believe it, that's brilliant. And Simpsons eventually was taken down. It was owned by the Savoy, and they built this large building just to the east, just to the left, effectively, of the Savoy in 1904.
Yeah.
And it was one of the rare purpose-built restaurants. I mean, a certain amount was there. And the first floor of Simpsons, we've got the Grand Divan, which is the famous restaurant with the beef trolleys, etc., on the ground floor. But on the first floor, we have a bigger restaurant, and that's going to be called Romano's. And Romano's was a restaurant opened on the Strand, and late 19th century, and it originally eclipsed Simpsons. It was opened by a Russian who'd adopted an Italian name, as in Romano, who had a great passion for Franco-Anglo cuisine, and of course that was the times of Escoffier and Ritz and so on. So that was very common in Britain, and that was bombed in 1942. In fact, you can see the building because it's now the Stanley Gibbons building there, but it was bombed out, and so I'm celebrating that, and we're also celebrating the chess element. It's a lot of the chess grandmasters around the world consider it to be the home of chess. So they've had world championships there and so on. And we'll continue that. If you walk in, you'll find murals depicting chess games, but painted in the style of Duchamp, because he, as a painter, he was obsessed with chess as well. And there will be a good balance, because Simpsons on gender, because Simpsons was always very male and had its own separate ladies dining room, ladies restaurant, which made me very uncomfortable. There was all these stories of the above the door to the Grand Divan was a clock which was stopped at 1 o'clock, and they would always, the old misogynists would say, yes, it stopped the first time a woman walked over the threshold. And I was very uncomfortable about this and the notion of a ladies' restaurant until I spoke to the archivist at Savoy. She said, oh, no, don't misunderstand. The women didn't want to be anywhere near the men. And I said, well, is that because of the men's behavior. She said, yes. I mean, you're in a beautiful crinoline dress or something. You don't want to be in a room full of cigar smoke with smelly men drinking and shouting at each other. We want more. And I thought, oh, I feel better about that. And I might well do ladies' evenings in the private room. But it is a remarkable room. It's 21,500 square feet, which is almost twice as big as Adele.
21,500
square feet.
That's like an entire club, members club or something.
Yeah, it's massive. One of the benefits, although slightly costly, is that almost half of it is back of house. Normally in London, for instance, you're lucky if you get 40% back of house. Normally it's around 30%. In New York, it's often 20%.
Yeah,
which means it's not a great environment for the staff. And in this day and age, you have to produce a better working conditions all around. I adore it. And I have done for a long time. I tried to buy it in 2000.
Oh, wow.
Just at the time, left the Ivy Caprice Chic and it was reported in the paper, and tried again in 2008, tried again in 2015, and so on. Eventually, 2022, the offer was accepted.
Yeah.
It is the last Grande Dame restaurant in London.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's in an interesting part of town, isn't it?
Yeah.
The Strand is really fascinating because it's right in the middle of everything. It's right near the river. It's got huge heritage buildings like Simpson's and the Savoy. And yet it's often seen to people who live in London as kind of a thoroughfare between, I guess, I don't know what, you got Aldwych to the east.
The city, yeah.
And the city. And then you've got Soho or the South Bank. And it's not somewhere I ever really go.
No, and yet it is at the fulcrum of
it should be one of the great high streets.
Absolutely. And there's been attempts to change it. I used to sit on the North Bank board because, of course, I had Delaunay there. And there was an attempt, I don't think it's ever really stuck, to call it Midtown.
Interesting.
To ape New York, because the Midtown is very legitimate in New York, never really caught hold in London. However, things have changed. Is less of a thoroughfare, and yet pretty close to the city. It went into demise to a degree also because of Fleet Street being migrating. However, with 180 Strand and Mark Waller doing a great job there, and you've the Soho House and all sorts of things, and Nick Jones's new hotel and corner store and so on, is making a big difference. So it's got all the theatres already. That's a 180 Strand. Somerset House is undergoing quite a revolution. And you have in one of the most beautiful period areas where Georgian and Deco architecture combine is in the Adelphi.
Amazing building.
And Condé Nast have just moved into the Adelphi. So suddenly it's transforming.
Yeah. That really does feel like a New York building.
Yeah.
In fact, is there still Smith and Wollensky's, the steakhouse?
They're still there.
Yeah, very, very American expense account dining.
Yeah.
Well, no, I think it's long due renaissance. The Strand, is it estate owned or is it owned by different people? The actual land?
It's quite a variety.
Okay.
It's not.
That makes it harder, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, you put your finger immediately on one of the reasons where certain areas work. In the Howard Walden estate around Marylebone, it makes a big difference. The Rugby estate around Lamb's Conduit Street in Holborn, Cadogan, of course, to a degree, Grosvenor. I think they went through a very difficult period where they became very commercial, but I think they're now caring more and more about the environment and who's there. Because the trouble is that if you just take the highest rents, you end up again with homogenization or inappropriate buildings. But that most of those landlords are realizing that by curating their estate, they can enhance it.
Yeah. I think Cadogan, I may be wrong with this rule, they have a sort of soft rule that you can't have more than 2 sights of it. So if you've got it, no chain can really go there. Well, I think they're being very, very mindful of every single thing that goes in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, as they should.
They really are trying to curate it. There's Hugh Seaborn is the CEO of it, and under the new Earl, he's really gets it. He really understands it.
Yeah. Well, we're very excited for the Strand resurgence led by Simpsons. So what should we order on day one? What's the sort of classic thing?
You kind of got to go for the roast beef if you're not. But if you're vegetarian, you won't be precluded. But you might be going for mulligatawny soup or even Russian salad. Who's seen Russian salad?
What is a Russian salad?
Russian is basically diced carrots and potatoes and so on. But there'll be you'll even find for instance mutton.
Wow.
You don't see a lot of mutton in London. There's one or two people are starting to use it.
Yeah.
And the trolleys will develop as time goes on. And if you go there, if you're a carnivore, go for breakfast. One of the great challenges amongst rugby players apparently is different days before they play a big match, they'd go to Simpson's to get the 10 deadly sins, which is what it was called, which is basically a full English breakfast, but enhanced with kidneys and chops and so on.
So will you offer the 10 deadly sins?
Yeah, we'll do the 10 deadly sins.
I didn't think there was 10 sins. I thought it was just 7.
I think there is, but
you've got 3 more.
By the time you add on fried bread and so on,
it starts to get sinful. And how much should we tip what's the suggested tip for my server?
Well, it's a good question. And I was talking to somebody, I was a bit shocked because they said, well, it used to be a £5 when it was really going sort of 10, 15 years ago or more. And we haven't decided. We're just watching carefully. I'd rather not be intimidating with it because it's there's already a cost.
Right, but you got to go with some cash.
Unless you buy some cash from us.
Oh, very good.
Yeah, very
good. It's quite a move actually if you're at the table and and so you just pass a little note.
Yeah,
it's quite
just give
slick.
It to the it's being member of the club.
Yeah,
and there's a lot of things which people haven't seen for a long time. You'll find on the menu you can get a carafe of hock. Instance, and there's a fairly extensive German wine list as
hock. That's sort of 9%. Is it 8%?
8% normally,
and slightly off dry or even sweet.
Yeah, and the Moselles, the Riesling, Cabinets, etc., are much drier, and actually some wonderful wines which are out of and as often for you. If I go back, I'm old enough now, is that my early days of being aware of people eating is that you would have Liebfrau, Blue Nun, Mathieu's Rosé, and all those sort of things, and Black Forest Gâteau and prawn cocktail, a lot of which people are now realizing. I remember once saying to a pastry chef, I want to do Black Forest Gâteau. I'm not doing that. And that's, I said, there's a reason why it became popular, because if it's done properly, it's really good. It's the same with a prawn cocktail or whatever. So I quite like bringing back some of the older.
Definitely.
And there will be a differentiation because the first floor restaurant will be cheaper than the ground floor restaurant in the way that Zedel was cheaper than Wolseley.
Yeah, amazing. So what's next then? If you stumbled upon a site this afternoon, you walked out and saw a beautiful site, and it took your imagination, would you be up for doing something else?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there something already in the works then?
No, I've looked at things, but one or two things which I really wanted. One I let go because the timing was so wrong. I just keep my eyes open for it. I've got wonderful people who deserve to have effectively their own restaurants. Right. And it takes me back to myself working for Joe Allen in 79 to 81. And his model was that whilst it was the eponymous Joe Allen as a chain, he started opening other restaurants. For instance, he had, can't remember his name, Jacques, I think it was, who working in New York, but was French, wanted to go back to Paris. He said, open a Joe Allen in Paris. And then Richard Polo, who I worked with originally, went to LA with Joe Allen, which wasn't particularly successful, but then came over to London. One of the pleasures I get is helping people develop their career. And whilst I still have the energy and the ability to walk around the room, I'll continue to do it.
Okay, very good. The last question I want to ask you then is a slightly selfish one, I suppose, because you've written an amazing book which has got incredible reviews and is a thing of beauty in itself. As a writer, it sort of almost cheeses me off that you've managed to come out with such a flawless piece of work. What was that process like for you writing that book? Both the actual physical pain of writing, which can sometimes be heavy lifting, but also delving so much into the past and into probably sometimes some difficult areas as much as lovely ones.
Well, thank you for the commendation. It was difficult for a variety of reasons. One is for me to even consider doing it was very hard. And Ed Victor, who is no longer with us as an agent, and subsequently Caroline Michelle, who was my agent and very good friend, were persuading me to do it. And I said, the trouble is that a restaurateur memoir is probably the most boring genre of book you can find. I've got a whole library of restaurateur, and they really, names like Leone, who opened Quo Vadis, his title was I Shall Die on the Carpet. And,
right.
And they're all sort of full of, there was a guy who had the place in Piccadilly and who would say it was my honor to serve the beggar Marga Khan. I mean, it gets boring. It becomes a list of names. And I say, I can only do it if I can find a point and that's when I suddenly realized I was learning about life through restaurants as opposed to just recounting famous people who came through, although there's an element of that. And that gave me the motivation, and I'd started writing. But when I was at the depth of the fight, it was reported to me, and I don't know how true it was, that somebody had said, we're going to destroy that Jeremy King.
Wow.
And whether it was true or not, I went to my lawyer and I said, how would you destroy me if somebody set out to destroy me? And he gave me all these reasons, and they're amazing. I couldn't believe it. Contractually, I could be denied from ever claiming that I had anything to do with the Wolseley and all sorts of things, because I felt like I was in an episode of Suits or something like that. It was so. But I said, oh, well, good luck with that to them. And, and they said, yeah, no, we're fine. I said, oh, one thing. He said, are you writing a book? And I said, yes. He said, how far in? And I said, I don't know, 25, 30,000 words or something. Mm-hmm. And you've been writing it on holiday? And I said, no, I write it when I get a chance. It never happened if it was on holiday. He said, and you were writing it by hand? And I said, no, I write it on my laptop. Your laptop? Oh, well, the company laptop. He said, well, stop writing and think about starting again, because the rights to that book belong to your old company.
Because you wrote it on a company laptop?
Because I was a company laptop, and my contract was basically I work when I work. And so I was writing it on company time. And that, it took us a year to sort out the dissolution.
Just copy paste and...
Yeah, I know. And it took us a year to sort it out, which was it was this big break when I wasn't writing. And then I had to get back to doing it again. But the important thing for me is that for it truly to be cathartic, which is one of my aims, I had to write it myself. The publisher saying, take a ghostwriter. I said, no, I have to write it myself. So I did enjoy the process. There was all sorts of complications, things, for various reasons, things got dropped, even at one point lost. And such is my nature, is that I can only see the shortcomings. I love the fact that people enjoy it so much.
Yeah.
And I of course have that post-publishing regret.
Of course.
Yeah,
Of course.
remorse.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, maybe in the next few years we'll get a chapter 2, a part 2 of the memoir.
Maybe if I feel it won't be boring. Yeah,
Okay,
I will.
I'm sure it'll be fascinating. Jeremy, thank you so much for this. It's been lovely.
Great pleasure. Thank you very much.